As I worked on the series of videos making the pair of pause tongs, looking at the comments and questions down below, as with so many tong making videos or any kind of tool making video, there are lots of questions about what kind of steel do I make my tongs out of. There are also lots of questions in the online forums, the Facebook groups. I get Instagram messages, private emails, things like that. By the way, the best place to ask a question about videos is in the video comments, not a private email. That's really not where I look for that kind of stuff, and I would prefer to keep those for my business use and not for YouTube use. But anyways, lots of people asking about what kind of steel do you make tongs out of, and why? Now, my preference is mild steel, and there are 3 reasons that I like mild steel. The number 1 reason is it's highly affordable, easy to come by. You go to any steel yard to buy steel and you ask for a piece of 1/4 by 1, which is what we made the pause tongs out of, they're going to sell you a piece of mild steel. Unless you specify that you want 1018 cold rolled or you want 5160 or 1085 or something like that, which most steel yards aren't going to provide for you anyways, you're going to get mild steel. Now, it also goes by the name of A36, but that's not a different material. That's not specifying a type of mild steel. It's just A36 is mild steel. Mild steel is A36 here in the US. Other countries will probably have different names, different designations, but the product is similar. It's a non-hardenable steel. And that is the other reason I like mild steel for tongs. It doesn't harden. Because it is non-hardenable, if you get your tongs hot in use, say you're holding a little piece in the tongs in the forge and you're afraid you're going to lose this piece down in the fire, so you put a tong clip on here and you leave it in the tongs while you're heating it, your tongs are going to get red hot. They're going to be a lot hotter than you'd like them to be. They may even get hot enough that they start to deform and change shapes a little bit. So it's quite common then between heats to take the tongs, quench them to get them cool so they don't change shape, and then put your material back in there, put the tong clip back on, go back for your next heat. If you do that with tool steel tongs or alloy steel tongs, you're risking breaking them. A lot of that stuff is not water hardening, and cooling it off in water is just asking for trouble in the long run. The third reason I like mild steel over an alloy steel or tool steel is it's way easier to forge. It is a lot more work to forge out something like 4130 or 4140 into tongs, especially if you're working by hand at the anvil, than it is to use mild steel. So mild steel is cheaper, it's easier, it is better in the long run, especially if you're a new smith and you're liable to have to quench those tongs from time to time, especially if you have other people in your shop that may not know they shouldn't quench your tongs. Now, if you make them out of an alloy steel, you might need to make 2 or 3 pair of each size, so when one pair starts to get red hot, you can set it aside and let it air cool. You pick up a second pair, you go back to work. But that's something I don't really want to do in my shop. I'm running out of room to store tongs as it is. I don't need 3 or 4 pairs of tongs that do the exact same job. As long as I've got one good go-to pair of tongs for each size, I'm pretty darn happy. Now, a lot of commercial tongs are made out of alloy steel. I can't tell you exactly what. I suspect 4130, 4140, something like that. And this pair of flat jaw tongs got a little bit too close to the power hammer, and part of the jaw is now broken off. Wasn't a big deal. It didn't shoot across the room or anything like that. That is a risk when you have alloy steel tongs that get hit. They're not made to survive that kind of abuse. The advantage to alloy steels, 4130, 4140, frequently people use old sucker rod, is that you can make a slightly lighter weight pair of tongs, a little bit smaller. They'll be springier, and they might last longer as long as you don't abuse them. Tools that don't get abused in the blacksmith shop are few and far between. This is a harsh environment. And even though I own a lot of these tongs that are made from alloy steel, and I do my best to never quench them, things do happen, and they can break, and they can be problematic. So it's not what I like to make my tongs out of. It's just if I need a pair of tongs right now and I can buy a pair for $30 or $40 versus spending 2 hours making a pair, yeah, maybe I'll put up with the alloy steel. Another very popular material that beginners use for making tongs out of is rebar. What is rebar? Well, it's concrete reinforcing bar, but what steel is it? What's in it? I don't know what's in rebar. Now somebody knows what's in rebar. It is not just random junk, even though that's a popular misconception. The steel mills that make rebar know exactly what's in it. The engineers that are designing dams meant to hold billions of gallons of water or bridges for major interstates specify exactly what that rebar has to do, and it has to be an exact material to fit those specifications. It isn't just random junk. But you and I don't know what's in that rebar. There's very little way for us to know. Some of it, the lug pattern on the rebar will actually tell you that, but I don't have a chart for that. I don't even know where I would get a chart for that. So when you buy rebar, you got no idea if you are getting a medium carbon steel, a high carbon steel. If it's medium or high carbon, is it going to be air hardening? Is it going to be water hardening? Is it going to be oil hardening? It's going to have all the same problems any other high or medium carbon steel has for tongs. It's going to be a lot harder to work, and it's going to have the risk of breaking if you need to quench those tongs in use, or if you quench them as part of the manufacturing process. The other problem you have with rebar is all those little lugs are something that's going to get forced down into the material if you draw out the reins. If you don't draw them out, they're non-slip tongs, but they're really uncomfortable and miserable to use. But if you do forge them down, those are a lot of little places for cold shuts to form. That means that you're going to end up with some little sharp edges that you might cut yourself on, or you're going to end up with a place for cracks and fractures to happen if you're squeezing too hard on the tongs. Over the years, rebar has a much higher chance of failure if you've forged all those little lugs down into the bar. I know a lot of people salvage rebar, they get it for free, it's cheap stuff. But if you're buying new material, if you're going to the home center and buying a 10-foot piece of rebar, chances are it is cheaper to go to a steel yard and buy a 10-foot piece of new mild steel, and you'll get better tongs out of it. I really discourage the use of rebar, even though I completely understand. I too have made tongs out of rebar. They were not the first pair of tongs I made, but they were the worst pair of tongs I made. They were my least favorite to use. I was happy to throw them away. In fact, they might be the only pair of tongs that I ever actually disposed of instead of passing them on to somebody else. They just weren't worth the trouble. So in making tongs, I really advocate for mild steel, especially if you're learning. If you have more experience and there's a reason you need bigger tongs that are lighter weight because you're working 3-inch square bar under a power hammer and you don't want a pair of tongs that weighs 20 pounds, maybe you do need to work with alloy steels. But for beginners making tongs that are going to hold 1/4-inch, 3/8-inch stock, simple flat tongs, simple bolt jaw tongs, the pause tongs, all of those things are best made out of mild steel. And again, there aren't different types of mild steel. It's just mild steel. It's just whatever is sold in your part of the world as mild steel or non-hardenable steel or structural steel. You can call it all sorts of things, but it's all the same stuff. It's the stuff welders buy to make trailers out of. It's the stuff fabricators use for making fences and gates and railings and things like that. It's just mild steel. But I hope in general that you found this useful and helpful. If you did, give it a thumbs up. If you haven't done so already, I would love it if you hit that subscribe button. If you haven't watched the full series on making the pause tongs, I strongly encourage you to go back and watch that series, or go back to the introduction to tong making video. I'll link it right up here. In that video, we made a very basic tongs out of flat bar. We didn't need any tongs to make those tongs, and they are a very useful beginner's pair of tongs, again, made out of mild steel. But in any case, I hope you can get out to your shop. I hope you can make something, but stay safe, wear your safety glasses. We'll see you for the next one.